live stream. How are we doing? Are we sounding okay? Are we looking okay? I am I am slightly nervous because I am using a different streaming software than the A10 Mini, which is what I normally use. Because we have a guest today. So, welcome. This is Talking Dough and Eating Donuts, where we eat a donut and we talk about dough. So, I really want to get to our guest, so I will only very briefly show you the donut for today, which is going to be a lime coconut twist. It's nice and, it's got a nice green money theme going on here. Also, this sweater is coming off. We made it 1 minute into the stream before I was like, yeah, my arms are overheated. Be Queer Make Stuff says, you are a little less crystal clear than usual, but still fine. Yes, that is a known variable. I am going to only be in 720p today, and that is because I don't want to pay $50 for StreamYard Pro. So normally I stream on the A10 Mini, and I can do as high of resolution as I want to do. But Robert says video equals good, audio equals good, donut equals good. Well, we're about to talk about capitalism and the inevitable failings of the financialized America, so we'll turn that good around there. Yeah, a lot of people are noticing that the image is a lower quality. Yep, that is going to be that is just going to be true. But maybe my skin looks better in 720p. I remember how everybody looked like back when YouTube was like even lower than 720p and everybody was filming on potatoes. We all just looked a lot better. And then we got the HD cameras and even the 4K, and you're like, oh, you can see every pore. Capitalism equals bad. Hot take. There we go. Well, this is going to be the intro. I'm just going to jump into today's topic because it sounds like you all can hear me. So, I'm really excited about this, and actually, this is kind of my new boss that we're having on today. So we are going to talk about if anti-capitalist investing is an oxymoron. Like, is it even possible to be an anti-capitalist and invest? And how to consider your ethics around capitalism and what you might view as an unsustainable system when it comes to also making sure that you secure your future. And you have to interact with financial systems, especially if you live in the US. We are a very highly financialized country, including like accessing healthcare. So talking about that. So our guest today is Victor Chaim Schramm, who has tons of letters after his name: CFS, CAS, AIF. But he actually originally received his bachelor's in Russian and East European history from the University of Oregon in 2007. Since his university studies, he has worked in the art supplies, sales, and candy manufacturing industries. In 2012, he relocated from Brooklyn, New York to Portland, Oregon, and set to work founding an independent registered investment advisor firm. He is a self-described investing nerd who spends much of his free time reading authors from all corners of the economic and finance world. And he's most in line with the environmental, social, and governance style of investing and seeking social responsibility backed by empirical insights. Business and finance ethics is a topic of particular interest, and authors such as Rabbi Elliot Dorff and Moses L. Pava have been highly influential on his philosophy and the practice of Chaim investment advisors. He's particularly interested in halachic finance, Jewish law, and anything working with religious people and communities on exploring applied ethics in finance. I'm super excited to have him on. And like I mentioned, I am now a plan consultant for Chaim investment advisors. So standard disclosures apply, which is none of this is investing advice. This is just for educational purposes only. Anyway, let's bring Chaim on. Here we go. I like that Oro's comment here. Be queer, make stuff. Capitalism equals bad. Just stayed on the screen.
Excellent. Yes, good thematic
welcome, Chaim.
motif.
Oh, I don't think we can hear your audio now.
Really?
Did that fail for me?
Let's try to do...
Did we mute you and then we turned everything off?
Let's see if that works.
Or is it me? Lovely. Can everyone else? Oh, everybody else can hear you, but no, I can't. Even better. Everybody's favorite. Chaim, introduce yourself while I fix my own audio.
All right. Well, I'm Chaim and excited to be here. Lillian and I actually recorded a podcast last week that is going to go up on our Chaim Investment Advisors YouTube, and excited to talk again in the podcasting format.
Okay, I can
Albeit
hear you now.
excellent.
I tried to be clever and cast my essentially cast my thing so that I would be looking a little less down at the computer because I don't normally have guests on my setup, and apparently that broke my entire speaker system. No, it was not Aaron Parecki's fault. Don't blame him, Christopher. Yeah, I mean, okay, so this has been a hotly requested topic for a long time. I think anti-capitalist is it's perhaps the most intense of the questions that folks have, which is just like, how do I live my values when it comes to and also like make sure that I am not destitute on the streets,
Right.
because it's hard to invest at this point when you feel like everything is tainted, right? And anti-capitalism is, I think, a stronger set of ethics or values than a lot of other kind of environmental, social governance kind of style of investing. Like, if you just want to make
Right.
sure the earth isn't polluted, that's very different than not wanting to participate in a financialized society, right?
Absolutely. I mean, but from a certain perspective, sometimes anti-capitalist investors have an easier time than other flavors of socially responsible or ethical investing, in my experience, because they've completely uh, stopped suspending disbelief about how capitalism works. And that, for a lot of people, is a much more like comfortable perspective to reach. It's a very kind of existentialist approach to, living in America. That does kind of work for a lot of people who are doing anti-capitalist investing in ways that, sometimes if you're really trying hard to do socially responsible, and you're kind of maybe more progressive and want the current system to be reformed enough to work really well, that can be a profoundly disappointing and demoralizing perspective. Whereas anti-capitalists who are, invested in just making sure that they have a retirement in the future, haven't always, or actually they generally don't kind of buy in to the more, philosophical or ideological aspect of living in America and how markets work.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I know that you have a very interesting background with your relationship with anti capitalism because you grew up in a household where this was essentially the replacement for religion, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I would love for you to tell us about like what your background with anti-capitalism was prior to you getting into financial services, and then how that changed as you started doing this as your job.
Right. Yeah. I've had an interesting and long and complicated history and relationship with anti-capitalism, because I grew up in a very kind of anti-capitalist uh, household, and beyond that, more occasionally Marxist-Leninist. And by the time I was a teenager, very much saw myself as, a revolutionary Marxist, and that's an interesting place to start life as somebody in America. And yeah, so I kind of started out with that perspective, and very intensely believed in that. And then when I became a Soviet history major, that changed a lot. I got pretty disillusioned in a lot of ways with revolutionary Leninism in particular. Not, I would not describe myself as I'm kind of a lapsed Leninist, I would say. And so that's how I started
I,
out with that. And
I think that's how the country of Russia would also describe itself, as a lapsed Leninist.
yeah, hopefully I have a healthier perspective than the norm of Russia at this exact moment. But um, who knows? But yeah, that's how I started out with the anti-capitalism. And the first time I ever registered to vote, I registered as SPUSA, and that's my kind of political history with that. And then uh, I became an investment advisor because we have in my family we have the hippie trippy left coasters, and I'm one of those. But we also have the Wall Street people who stayed on the East Coast and are still very entrenched in Wall Street. And I wanted to understand, well, what they know about America that I don't. And at some point I said, well, I can probably help people understand how this works, even if I have uh, substantial misgivings about it. And that is the beginnings of Chaim Investment Advisors, was that. And the longer that I've done this, probably the more anti-capitalist I've become, honestly.
Oh, interesting.
There's nothing like
As you've gotten more and more knowledgeable, you've started to feel more anti-capitalist.
yeah, especially I do a lot of pro bono work or discounted work a lot of the times with especially Portland's Northeast Portland's Black community, usually baby boomers in the African American community in Portland, and that has made me much more anti-capitalist probably than I was when I started to say, like, the way that we do retirement in America is pretty wacky and definitely not socially just, in my opinion. And so, yeah, I've kind of become uh, more skeptical, even though I was already skeptical over time, working in the finance industry for sure.
So, how do you? We're getting a lot of opinions about anti-capitalism in the comments, and so I think it's worth. I think it's worth defining it because I think one, it's one of those terms that's hella broad, and
Yes.
so like capitalism is very broad because the implementations of capitalism and its permutations are so diverse that as the way Christopher is saying is capitalism on its own is not evil or antisocial. Abusive capitalism is, which is how a lot of people feel. They like I'm trained as an economist, so I believe that markets do have value, but I also believe that markets break down and are not the solution under a lot of circumstances because markets can be abused and manipulated and they don't work for social goods. So how do you, when you talk about investing from an anti-capitalist perspective, like how do you define anti-capitalism?
A lot of the times, I kind of come to it from a practitioner standpoint. And so I really focus on non-ideological topics actually when I'm, because I do teach a lot about anti-capitalist investing and finance, and do a lot of education work, public education work around this. And a lot of times I try to make it as non-ideological as possible because so many people are bringing so many perspectives to it. And certainly my perspective is not one that even most anti-capitalists would share, because I'm a religious person, and that's a profound element to my interest in this topic. And of course, it is not going to be the case for most people who are anti-capitalist at all. And so um, I try to make it as non-ideological as possible, because so many different movements might be anti-capitalist or skeptical of capitalism. But I think we can say that anti-capitalism is anti-colonial, and that is how a lot of the people who are drawn to my work, or a lot of the people I do work with, are very interested in that, in anti-racism, in anti-colonialism. And so a lot of social justice causes might be uh, fitting in some way to the anti-capitalism label. And then you get everything from Maoist people, certainly work with people from that perspective, all the way to people who are very skeptical of capitalism but are still quite progressive, I would say.
Interesting. Like I guess the I guess the challenge that I think a lot of folks have when they're talking about anti-capitalism from an investing perspective is every part of our lives are so financialized in
Right.
America, which is like if you Google what is the most capitalist country, America is the search results, which I could make some arguments against that, but 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 like every part of our lives, like my interactions with housing, my interactions with healthcare, my interactions with just trying to get cash out, and the way in which our basic financial and trade systems have been part of a capitalist model. Like I believe in the power of markets, and I do think that there is a lot of value in I exchange this good for this service. Like I like money. Just to be, there was a time in my life where I thought I was one of those radicals that was like, let's go back to trading goats in order to buy a tattoo or whatever. And I've way evolved past that, probably due to the indoctrination of getting an economics degree. But I've I there's a lot of efficiencies in the existence of capitalism, and then there's a lot of necessities that are tied to capitalism in our postmodern industrialist society. So how do you even begin to approach like taking the parts out of it that you don't want when you're looking at like I need to have retirement, I'd like a place to live, I'd like to like not die. So how do you start to like approach it?
Right. So for me, a lot of the times, the starting point is saying of an anti-capitalist investor is to say, well, it shouldn't be the way that it is, and it should not be as financialized. It should be very different. We shouldn't, have uh, such privatized retirement system. We shouldn't have a retirement system that is so geared towards wealth accumulation and not geared towards income security. Um, those things should be fundamentally very different, and health should be done very different. But I do live in America, or live in a Western capitalist country, and I have to make sure that certain things exist for me to survive. And uh, so you don't have where I like to start with folks is to say you don't have to believe in capitalism or enjoy capitalism or be ideological about capitalism to make sure that you're setting yourself up for the kind of security that America just expects that you will do. And you absolutely have to do that for yourself. It's the bizarre and unfortunate way that we do things. So anti capitalist investing really starts with saying, okay, we want it to be different. And I still have to make sure that I'm going to survive. And so survival is the number one topic that I talk about in anti-capitalist investing. Is you got to survive. Other people also need to survive, and so there's a lot of community and mutual aid that can be rolled into those conversations, and usually is. But it does start with that point of saying, well, markets, you don't have to believe that they're good or that they work to understand how they work. And most of the time, that's the perspective that I'm
You,
working with
you don't have
people
to
in.
like it, but you
But
have
right,
to
and
engage with it.
one thing that I like to share with a lot of folks to make that more real is that, in my opinion and in my experience, the people in the finance industry that are doing it at the highest level, that are really intense capitalists, right? In terms of they won the game, they aren't ideologically capitalist either. A lot of them are very good at a function or very good at understanding a system, and maybe have high social intelligence or uh, certain other forms of intelligence and a lot of privilege. They're just there. And so you also had, as a Soviet history person, you saw the same people showing up there too. They always were the attaches that were very successful, and those people didn't believe in Leninism any more than a lot of the billionaires believe in capitalism. They're just doing it. And honestly, that's really what anti-capitalist investors are also doing.
Um, okay, so there's some discussion about the value of a goat relative to a tattoo. I think this is very important. Philosophical questions aside,
Right.
Rural says goats are too valuable to trade for tattoos anyway. And I was gonna say, it really depends on the piece, right? Like, there are certain goats and certain tattoos that may or may not have relatively equal value. And Bridger says it does depend on the tattoo. Um, the Latitude says, I'm late because I'm studying for a test, but a guest, this is very exciting. Great. I think you'll like this topic, Latitude. New Bold One says that we can only trade a goat for a tattoo if the tattoo is of a goat, which I think is relatively fair. Eric's trying to bring us back on topic here. So, winners losers dichotomy is always an innate colonial trait. Everything in a colonial system is exploitable, including people. That's a very good point, Eric. I think that pulling at the threads of capitalism and picking the parts that you're uncomfortable with, I think are the first strategy if you are going to acknowledge that you have to survive in a capitalist system while also wanting to retain some of that anti-capitalist values when making sure that you can survive in this system. And I think that like recognizing that colonialism and the exploitation of other humans is a lot of the inherent critiques of capitalism. Like I said, I think markets are pretty great. I think money is a pretty cool tool, but I certainly don't like the fact that what we have is a winner-loser extracting value from, societies that are less good at capitalism than societies that are better at capitalism. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, Chaim.
Right, because that actually kind of loops into a question that you had sent, like a pre-question about debt markets and ownership, right? We have a very interesting market system in the West where we have two flavors of investing that pretty much everything falls into. You have the ownership flavor, which often is exploitative, and there is very little way around that. And then you have the other style, which is loaning style, debt markets, which often are more geared towards institutions and public and social funding. And those are potentially, or in some regards, less exploitive.
Really? Because I would say, when I look at debt securities, and I particularly think about debt securities in the context of colonialism, all I think is World Bank, IMF, and
Right.
which are like that is capitalist colonialism, right? Like the vestiges of whatever. Oh, we have the British Empire now has really just been turned into the American and developed world colonialism of the developing world via debt, via the World Bank. And so it's like, for me, I think I feel even more strongly about debt as contributing to a lot of the problems with capitalism when it comes to colonialism.
Oh, yes. Yes.
As like equity, like owning a piece of something, to me sounds more collectivist and more anti-capitalist than the owning a piece of someone owing me money.
Right, and like that's happening in Sri Lanka right now. Like the collapse of Sri Lanka that's happening at the moment we're talking about this is very much part of that conversation, and a lot of that debt funding of international development comes from actually a post-colonial perspective that, well, we can't allow capital flow into our countries and own all of the assets and the production capacity of our economies. We can't allow that. We have to have a certain amount of protection over the ownership of assets. And you see that that was the status quo in Russia before the current war, of course. You had a lot of that where there was a preference for international debt funding over foreigners being able to own Russian companies because they had a disastrous experience after the end of the Soviet Union with that, and assets just being stripped out of the country. And a lot of other countries that have been really heavily funded with debt have had fears about that happening to them as well, that you would have a lot of foreign exploitation of local capacity. And so that's why there is this kind of heavy balance towards debt, and sometimes it works out okay, and sometimes it works out very, very badly, as in Sri Lanka um, is one of those.
I feel like we're now getting into, I don't know if you've seen The Good Place, but essentially the conclusion of The Good Place is that no one can get into the good place, which is essentially heaven in the afterlife, because it turns out that every decision you make is linked to some system of oppression or some bad outcome, and there's no good options at all anymore. And I feel like this is, a question that a listener had, which is just like, if you're participating in investing at all, doesn't that mean feeding the capitalist beast? Like, even if you're like, I'm just going to hold all my cash in a savings account, who is that savings account with? Probably one of these banks that like collapsed the United States economy 10 years ago. So like, I guess, how do you feel about the fact that like any form of investing is essentially feeding the capitalist beast?
A lot of times, one of the perspectives I have on equity investing in particular is that equity is largely not necessarily benefiting the companies themselves. That's not how they, by the time that you are the purchaser of stocks, you're not really giving the company money anymore. You just are now a passive owner of them, largely because companies fund themselves through equity. Really, they only get the big payday at the beginning, the IPO.
Mm-hmm.
That's their moment where they do really well. And then the executives certainly benefit from you buying the stock. And insiders tend to benefit a great deal. So the directors and CEOs, yes, they love it when you go out and buy the stock. But the company itself isn't necessarily being fed as much by you buying the stock as they are by you buying their services and products. That's the main way that they ultimately have money. And so that's
Right.
um, so to me, anti-capitalist investing um, is really saying, well, it's the structural way that capitalism works that has to change before capitalism changes. How you invest isn't necessarily even consequential to whether America becomes
So
better or not. Um,
you're
yeah.
saying we're all floating on a big rock, and it turns out that, like, just putting money in my little index fund in my retirement plan is not going to undo capitalism, or refusing to do so. Therefore,
Although
when I
I
went to
will
pick up the
say,
donut this morning, the donut worker said, people keep asking me if they should have an extra donut. And I say, have as many donuts as you want. The world is collapsing. And I feel like that's kind of the philosophy when
well,
it comes
you
to
can.
investing.
One of the there's like three main areas that I like to talk about with anti-capitalist investing. One of them is survival. The other is two out of three is subversion. So there are ways to be a subversive investor for sure, and that's can become a focus if you are really into anti-capitalist investing, and that's an area that's seeing a lot of success. That's the good news, is that the more subversive activist investors are actually having a great deal of impact at this moment, which I find exciting. It's much more exciting now than it was 10 years ago. There was very little in terms of activity around being like actively subversive within markets. That was not really a thing, and now it's actually quite widespread, I would say. And yeah, so there are ways to be subversive, but they are kind of something that you have to know that you're doing that. It has to be a goal that you understand, because just like all subversive activities, you kind of need to have tactics and goals understood ahead of time.
Yeah, okay. So that, like, Meerkat from the forums really was wanted to be very specific about, like, what does this look like for a casual investor? Because They said, I like set it and forget it investing with diversified funds. Usually I check my
Right.
balances monthly, but I haven't even done that the last few months because life's been busy. You're probably very smart with that, Meerkat. No one should be
Yes.
checking their balances right now. I have no idea what businesses even make up the funds I invest in. Anti capitalist investing seems like it would be a lot more hands on. So, do you think there is a way to be a anti capitalist as a casual investor?
I think that most anti-capitalist investing should be very casual, because one of the things that I talk about a lot is some of the mythology around capitalism that can be quite toxic to participants is believing that you're going to go and beat the market. Beating the market or having special information, those are two ways to actually harm yourself as an investor. and most anti-capitalist investors have the advantage of not believing that you're going to go pick the next Apple stock, or you're going to, you know, fantastically beat the market, or that beating the market really is something that can happen. Most anti-capitalist investors, I think, are more data driven, which, data driven investing probably steers you towards being a great deal more passive. And so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the good news is, yeah,
So,
you actually
I
can
mean,
do
but
that.
to me, this sounds like we're just saying efficient market hypothesis, which is just like there is no. Uh, the basics of it are that you can't really know anything and everything's a random walk. Therefore, it's best to just be buy a slice of everything in the market generally, right? Um, like it sounds like you're saying that setting it and forgetting it from a passive perspective and kind of abiding by efficient market hypothesis in the purest of terms is a way to be anti-capitalist because you can then focus a lot of your other energy on
Yes.
dismantling the actual capitalist systems.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Your energy usually, unless you're inside the finance industry, you have a great deal of capital. Your energy as an anti-capitalist is usually best spent, you know, getting out and doing things like we're doing right now, which is like
Right.
being active, talking, learning. Those are much more important uses of your time, because there is kind of a hamster wheel of investing that you can hop on and waste a profound amount of time on, which is trying trying to get out there and feed the market and doing uh, better than everybody else, so that you can escape capitalism with capitalism by being more successful than everybody else. You can, check out and be done with it, and that's how you end up escaping. And I hear that a lot, and it's generally one of the more unhealthy, I think, approaches that you could have to doing anti-capitalist investing.
I need to accumulate so much money that I can then get out of this system. Or like I'll win at
Right.
capitalism so that I can then later dismantle it.
Right.
versus the idea that I will do just as well as the market because it's not worth me to care about that and then tag along to the philosophy of the idea that you're not by buying equity pieces of companies, so by buying stocks, by buying index funds, you're not really contributing to the overall performance of that company other than on the market as a whole. That's kind of like that's the passive casual investor kind of philosophy when it comes to their retirement. So Ash was asking, is this people actively trying to change the way things work through their investments, or is this hardcore ethical investing, meaning like even more narrow environmental social governance investing where you're really looking at the fundamentals of companies and making a decision about whether or not they're ethical based on your own criteria?
Right. There are some people who take it that way, and it's usually are people who have privilege and are saying, look, I'm going to recognize that I have privilege in the way of saying, this is how I'm going to use my time and my access. It is to be active. But your average person who just, has a job and maybe is in a labor union, they don't have necessarily the capital to get on a board of directors, or, you know, be highly influential in corporate governance. And not necessarily the best use of time a lot of the times for people who don't have access. So this is something that kind of falls onto people with a great deal of privilege to do a lot of. But another way to look at it would be that there are increasing numbers of people doing environment, social governance work who are saying, look, we can, as a fund, as a pooled investment vehicle, go out and bully corporate governance together. So you don't
Right.
really need to be showing up at the earnings calls and agitating to, have your fund be proxy voting to change how things are done.
So, I hope to actually talk about this more in depth on a another live stream where I talk with someone who actually works as a proxy consultant. But I
Excellent.
think that something that is only starting to be explored when it comes to pushing how companies function from any kind of ethical perspective, be it anti-capitalist or just be it environmental. Is that most of these the largest shareholders at this point are all these institutions that run these funds that most of us are invested in via our retirement plans, like
Yes.
Vanguard, Fidelity, whatever, because most of us are not going up to Apple individually or calling up our own stockbroker and being like, "Hey Bob, can you buy me one share of Apple?" Like nobody's doing that anymore, right? So
Right.
it's mostly we're just auto, investing in our retirement plan each month, like that's like 90% of middle class people. That's how they are engaging with investing. But a thing a lot of people don't realize is that because majority of those funds that Vanguard, Fidelity, the big ones hold are index funds or are ETFs that hold a lot of different companies. Most of those hire proxy consultants. So they hire firms that are relatively small, that their whole job is to figure out how Vanguard and Fidelity should vote on behalf of all the shares that they own, which are actually the shares that you own.
Yes.
And so it is, I think a lot of people don't realize the potential for pushing on that because proxy consultants are it's a pretty secretive kind of weird part of the financial industry, especially to your average casual investor.
Yeah, they're extremely important, especially in this more subversive plank, let's call it, of anti-capitalist investing would be very potentially exciting aspect of anti-capitalist investing would be uh, influencing corporate governance. That's one of the most important areas that anti-capitalist investors can get into because ultimately that is extremely important to how companies actually work
Doesn't
that are
that sound
publicly traded.
hard though? Doesn't that sound very, I mean, like I it seems a lot easier to be involved in mutual aid or things in your community where you get to see the
Right.
real tangible values, uh, like contributing to food boxes or dropping things off for neighbors in need or whatever it might be. It seems a lot more tangibly easier to work on that side of living your values than it is to be like, I'm gonna go try to figure out who votes for me at the shareholder meeting of
Oh,
all,
right.
500 companies I own in my S&P 500
Right.
ETF,
Right.
right?
No, that's absolutely true, and it's definitely something that, unless you have so much wealth that you're primarily preoccupied with managing it, that's the main thing you do in your life. And I work with some of those people that are out there, but it's not necessarily most people who are interested in anti-capitalism. Yeah, most of your energy really is best spent in your community and also in politics a lot of the time. That's something that I talk about with anti-capitalist investing is, anti-capitalist investors all recognize that politics is the answer. That's like most
Right.
of everything. And then
If you want to change the system, you have to change the actual system, right?
right, right, because capitalism in a lot of ways is not really ideological, and so you need political action to actually influence how capitalism happens, if it's going to exist, or to make it not exist. Right? It's just capitalism's just a legal framework of how people can have information and assets and uh, yeah, operate basically.
Yeah. Sirenai said, I was just talking with a friend from Germany about the ethical concerns he has investing in the American stock market ETFs because of the capitalist nature that trends towards exploitation, which is, I mean, quite frankly, how I would describe American capitalism trends towards exploitation because it is for profit above all other things, right? And whenever it is altruistic, it usually is that way. When it comes to publicly traded companies, at least, altruism is usually viewed in the context of profit. It's not viewed in the context of we're making the world better. It is viewed in the context of we are doing just enough to look like we're making the world better that we can then market that we're doing that so that we can make more money, right? Or save money on taxes, whichever it is so that we can make more money. So yeah, I guess I'm very interested in, Meerkat from the forums had like put down a huge list of all of the ETFs that their diversified, mostly index fund portfolio is sort of smattered between, and was like, can you individually evaluate all of these from an anti-capitalist perspective for me? That would be great. Okay, thanks, bye. And I was like, I don't think that's within the context of this. I think you need to probably hire Chaim as a financial planner if you want to dive into that. But how does anybody be diversified when I want to have investment in Chinese companies, but China, if you're talking about a system built off exploitation, because it's so different than I'm so used to the American style of exploitation, I've lived under it most of my life, that when I look at China, I'm like, oh, but that's bad exploitation because I'm not used to it. So it's hard for me to want to be invested in it. But there are parts of the Chinese economy that I'm quite bullish on. So how do you evaluate that kind of stuff as a casual investor?
As a casual investor, usually it's very difficult to answer those very complex questions casually, right? Where it's like those are actually pretty complicated, and gets into the like, okay, now you're a pretty active investor when you're looking at what specific areas do you want to be diversified into, because part of the question about diversification and the future of America is, okay, you could easily diversify into industries that, as an anti-capitalist, you may believe are not going to exist in the not too distant future. Like, for example, cars that run off of exploding fossil fuels. It's not necessarily going to exist into the future. And so that may not be an area that you want to diversify into. So basically, anti-capitalist investors usually are pretty critical investors, critical thinkers in terms of thinking about what diversification actually means. What are you actually getting into? Because diversification also is kind of a mythology in a way, like in American capital markets. It does not work the way that a lot of people in the consumer-facing realm, the consumers of financial products, are taught that it should work. It often doesn't actually work that way in practice. And so anti-capitalist investors they tend to be pretty critical thinkers about what even diversification looks like going forward.
Yeah, okay. Christopher asked who I believe is quite bullish on China. How is the China system exploitation? Well, I would strive to point out that I also think the American system is exploitative at a lot of cores. Like, a lot of the companies that are quite overvalued are overvalued because of VC money that got pumped into them that was based on exploiting workers and underpaying workers. But, China has a lot of reasons why exploitation is at the core of the capitalism model, which is mainly labor practices and human
Yes.
rights violations. And so that's sort of my core of concerns. I'm not anti-globalization. I think there's a lot of value in specializations in countries that have experienced poverty being like, yes, we are now having garments made in these countries because we've created a whole new industry. We've made it possible for women to work outside the home and earn for their family. Like, I think there's a lot of value in globalization, even when it comes to some of the more exploitative industries. I think it's great that we've developed this tech hardware industry in China. However, the labor practices are extremely exploitative, and a lot of that is linked to state human rights abuses, which is,
Right.
if you don't have the right paperwork or the right religion, then you are suddenly not able to work. Or if you are able to work, you're expected to work, 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Even in non-physical jobs, you see that a lot. And so exploitation of labor is my primary concern, but there is also a lot of environmental concerns about China's boom. They are now the largest polluter in the world. They've beat America. And so that is um those are my primary concerns. Their capitalism does have social, Christopher says, their capitalism has a built-in expectation of social responsibility. Correct, because their capitalism has socialism built into it, communism, because
Right.
communism is the leading party. But it is that social responsibility is done through the interpretation of conforming to a set of social standards, which also involves, I don't know, not practicing your religion, suppressing minority languages, suppressing minority ethnicities. So for me, that's, not, I don't want to get too deep into this because it's not beat up on China. We're all part of these different capitalist systems, and there's different flavors and interpretations of them. But at the core of the critiques of capitalism, they involve exploitation. It might be of the natural resources, it might be of the indigenous population, it might be of ethnic or religious minorities, it might be of other countries, but at the core, right, the critiques of capitalism are the exploitation of people. For me, at least, I
Yes.
think, like we started with, it's very freaking broad. So,
Right. Right.
oh my God. Christopher says suppression of minority. What? Oh, I don't know. Just talk to the Uyghur Muslims. Just, any of that. We're not going to get too deep into that, but,
Right.
so, KMIKM, though, as part of my rant, says, on the other hand, specialization leads to increased risk of extinction. Yes, which is exactly what we've seen in Bangladesh. Yeah. Ethnic minorities being forced to be in forced labor camps to re-educate them out of their religious practices is, in fact, exploitation. Fun fact.
Right.
Yeah. So it is. Yeah. So anyway, that was a bit of a rant there, but it can be challenging to figure out when every system of capitalism that you might invest in from an equities perspective, like, you want to be diversified, but also the lack of transparency that is inherent in investing in funds outside of your country, means that you are struggling with exactly that kind of thing.
Well, I think I can actually loop all of what you're saying back to some of the subversive aspects of anti-capitalist investing, which kind of starts at the beginning of being a subversive investor, which I think somebody had asked about in the chat. The way that you start is by requiring disclosure by companies. That is the number one, that is step number one, forced disclosure of activities. Because really, capitalism is at its most exploitative when nobody knows what's going on. And like, there is a complete vacuum of information and people can do whatever the heck they want. They tend to be the most abusive, right? When they're the most opportunity to be abusive exists. And so forcing disclosure is step one. And that is part of the problem with investing in China, is that anti-capitalist investing hopefully is operating off of good information. If you're being a critical thinker as an investor, you need good information. In my experience with China, having gone there and seen China and seen the special economic zones up front, I've been in multiple factories in special economic zones in China. Um, Frankly, as an American investor, I have very little confidence that you would get good information from those companies about what
Right.
they're doing. There is just not
Well, and
a culture of
that
disclosure there at all.
yeah, and the globalization of US markets means that and access to the US market being such a large and valuable tool, especially to Chinese companies, that we have since learned we're essentially taking over paper companies for fronts that weren't even real. Like, we've seen this abuse before with IPOs of Chinese companies that were not producing anything.
Right.
And so yeah, it's a great example of like once the more it's like a game of telephone, right? Like, when I lived in India, I worked with women that were leaving trafficking situations, and therefore it was women all over India, and that meant that everybody spoke a different language. But most of them, because they're Indian, spoke three languages, two or three. And because of that, anytime we wanted to get anything done in the laundry where we were at, it meant that I would go and I'd find Karam, and I'd be like, "Hey Karam, I know you speak Kannada and I know you speak Marathi." And now I know that So speaks Marathi and Konkani. And I know I know that Lou speaks Konkani, and also she speaks, Hindi and a little bit of Hindi. And then by the time we got to the end of the game of telephone, what I had originally communicated that we tried to translate across all of those languages, even though we were all in the same laundry room, it would actually end up being like the opposite. I'd be like, move this plant from here to here, and then it would move to a totally different part of the yard. Because it turns out anytime you play a game of telephone, some information is lost in translation. And that's even more true when you're dealing with a economy that's very capitalist, but also very low information, especially to foreigners, right? Which, once again, this is not the beat up on China time. I don't think China is there are lots of places in the world that need to be beat up on just as much. And I think America's unchecked and unbridled capitalism that everybody else wants to participate in and wants to have access to the American stock markets suddenly makes ours even more suspect, because it's held up as this, great this great indication of something that will never fail.
Right. And that's to me where ESG becomes so useful to anti-capitalist investors. ESG, obviously, I think anybody who's ever checked out ESG and followed its development doesn't probably believe that ESG is a basket of perfect, companies that are all fantastically altruistic and don't pollute and all of that. Really, all that ESG is doing, and especially in markets like China, like India, the developing world, Europe extensively, what it's doing is getting information out of people, saying, oh, what do you do? We just want to know what are your actual activities. And then you create a database of what people are doing, and you say, well, these are the leaders in these practices. And so we're going to pick the leadership and say, this is what we hope everybody gets to in this region or in this basket or in this industry. And from that, you just continually expect higher and disclose more information. And that's what ESG is. It's just an evolving database of activities that's trying to identify leaders and say, okay, the leaders are who we're really interested in becoming the standard. And we also really care about how companies are governed. And information disclosure is like, that's the most important, like, step one in good governance, is like
Yeah.
knowing like what they do. Anybody can say, yeah, I'm a great governor of this company that nobody knows anything about. Nobody hears anything about the operations of this company. Sure, I'm like, awesome. Um, Governance, really good governance involves disclosure and being accountable to the people who give you capital to use. Hopefully.
Yeah. Bridger asked, what is ESD? It is actually ESG is what we're saying, environmental social governance, which is just a term for ethical investing. But as Chaim is pointing out, pushing the governance of a investment is one of the primary ways, and looking at transparency, right?
Right.
Okay, Siren Eye has lots of amazing specific questions that I think are
Cool.
are really good, because I think this is one of the challenges when we're dealing with this is a lot of people are the kind of investor I am, which is the very index fund. I believe it's kind of self-cleansing. But Siren Eye is saying, like, a great example of like anti-capitalist investing perspective is that deforestation is an example of what could be natural resource exploitation, and certainly is in parts of the world. But in the US, logging companies actually plant more trees than they harvest. So is that part okay? Right? And I think that's like one of you're asking two people who live in Oregon, so we have a lot of opinions about logging companies.
Right. Yeah. Exporting the activity to places that we may not know a lot about how things are being done, increasing a lot of carbon strain on the entire supply chain, and probably not a great thing. Obviously, the closer you can log to yourself, the better, for sure. And the better information about what it takes to do that economic activity, probably the higher potential for investing without worrying too much is, because in
Yeah.
a lot of ways there are plenty of I'm a very much an international investor, very interested in it, and a lot of what I do is international investing. But that's the question I'm always asking myself, is what quality of information do I actually have about the activities here? Sometimes it's really good, it's more advanced than America even. Sometimes it's basically non-existent.
Um yeah, I guess that I think what's challenging about that though is if like say you're buying Weyerhaeuser. I'm saying Weyerhaeuser cuz anybody who lives in Oregon knows Weyerhaeuser cuz they own, like, I don't know, all the private logging land almost.
Yes.
But if you're gonna buy a security in Weyerhaeuser because you're like, well, it's in my backyard, log here. I know lots of people and employees, like, that economy is something that I interact with on a regular basis. I see the trees, I see the, little tree farms. I see the mills, I know who's employed by the mills. And looking at the information available, we can see exactly what Siren Ira is saying, which is that, like, they've realized they need to plant enough trees to be able to keep cutting them down for the sustainability of their own company. But who's to say that Weyerhaeuser isn't involved in, deforestation of the Amazon rainforest as well, right? Like, with the globalization of companies, how is it really possible to do that kind of investing when everything is so globalized?
Disclosure is like the number one lane. That's your lane to getting to that information. Is
Okay.
we know a huge amount about what Weyerhaeuser does, because they're actually organized as a real estate investment trust, which is a very unique uh, framework of
Tell me more. I didn't know that, but it makes perfect sense
yes.
living in Oregon.
Yes, they are actually registered as a real estate a REIT, a real estate investment trust, which is a very interesting. They didn't used to be this. This was something that they elected. I want to say in the late '90s. I could be remembering that wrong. It may have been more recent than that that they started to go that direction. But real estate investment trusts have to disclose a great deal of information about their activities to the public, because they are publicly owned at that point, and the profits that they can keep for themselves as a company are very small, and that means their ability to
Yeah.
grow at these huge internationalizing rates is actually less than a lot of companies which may be um, more similar to the exploratory exploitation of mineral resources, which are certainly could name a bunch of those, which maybe are not so great.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I had no idea that Weyerhaeuser is organized as a REIT, which is very
Yes.
fascinating. That's going to lead to one of my questions about real estate. But Sirenai is on the environmental train. Like, this is a common question a lot of people have, which is, I'm hearkening to the carbon offset credits. Where and how do you set the bar of an ethical company? Like Eric is pointing out, there are companies that do not plant trees and are yet selling carbon offsets. And so there's a lot of kind of fishy questions about the existence of these.
Right. I have a lot of insights into that because my family's business is very involved in carbon offsets. That's what my mom and my stepdad do. They're involved with a environmental technology research company that is very much invested in exploring opportunities for getting carbon offsets, and some of them are very dubious and some of them are very impactful. It's really very difficult to sometimes get good quality information about it. Not all carbon offsets are equal. I would say some of them really
Right.
are as
Ha-
shady as you might imagine.
has the requirement of essentially carbon in the European markets for like planes and other transit companies, has that increased the transparency? I should also know this because I definitely took, when I was living in Germany, I took a European governance and law environmental class. And honestly, that was what convinced me I don't want to be a lawyer. Because it takes them like 20 years to get any of this down. But have
Yes.
you, from an investing perspective, seen any increase in the value of carbon offsets or the availability of information that's been influenced by that large scale governmental kind of push towards them?
I'd say Europe, yes, but they're in a unique situation where uh, lying about what you're doing is not something you can legally do in Europe in the same way that you can elsewhere in the world, including in America. You can do much more misleading practices, and you can also. It's not necessarily always a crime to lie about what you're doing in regards to environmental activities in America. It is in Europe. Like those disclosures are legally binding. It's
It's not a crime to lie in America. That's really the key element here, right? Well, because we don't really have much regulatory frameworks around it, right? And they also just like defanged the Environmental Protection Agency in the Supreme Court like 2 weeks ago. But
right, and
we don't need to we don't we don't need to get super depressed
that
about
could be an
Supreme Court decisions
episode.
because we'd be here all day.
Yeah. But I would say Europe, yeah, Europe is an intriguing model because uh, if you make a disclosure and you know that you are lying, that is a crime, and there's actually a capability to investigate and punish you, which in America is not always. It depends. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Depends where and how you lied. But
And
in
how many judges you've paid off and the resources of your opponents, right? That's like
and your
the a
disclosures
lot of the
may be entirely voluntary in America, whereas in Europe, actually, they may be compulsory in the first place, which is different from America.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's actually really relevant to this question, which was, should we be concerned about the viability of long-term investing given the specter of climate change and how little we seem to be doing about it?
Yes, definitely 100% yes. And I'm definitely an advocate for thinking about the carbon risk of portfolios. That's something that I've worked on for a very long time and factored into my investing assumptions and analyses is to say, well, if you think climate change is real, and a lot of the finance world does not, to be clear, in America, a lot of the finance industry does not actually think that it's real. I was just sharing this on my Instagram, like last week, I went to this investor summit where this company, Loomis Sales, who's a major asset manager, one of their analyst was saying, well, decarbonization is this immense risk, huge financial risk to everybody that we're trying to decarbonize the world. And, and I sat there thinking, well, really, climate change is probably the financial risk that everybody should be worried about, not necessarily, decarbonization, maybe a short-term financial risk if you haven't thought much about it. But if you've thought a lot about it, it's very easy to dodge some of the impacts of decarbonization and maybe benefit from them as well. But there are a number of companies that are not going to function the same way, and there are a number of companies that are not going to function at all, per se, that are
Right.
publicly listed and have major multi-billion or tens of billions, sometimes capitalization right now.
Okay. And so your answer is no, because there will be people that are financially successful from climate change. Uh, and if you are thinking about your, I mean, it kind of comes to like my kind of key thing that I often tout when I talk about ethical investing, which is that like it is kind of impossible to feel ethical about your portfolio, especially if you need to be heavily invested in American companies because you're in America and you want to have your more of your portfolio weighted towards somewhere where you live. And like my theory has been that index funds are essentially self-cleansing, which is that like if you believe the arc of the universe bends towards justice and that you work to make sure that the other conditions, like you were saying, are there to force companies to and the market to become more climate change ready, to reward companies that are prepared for climate change, to reward companies in as a consumer that are doing things that are good for the world. Then if you believe the arc of the universe bends towards justice, the unethical companies will fall away. And if you have like a portfolio that is weighted across the entire market, eventually it will be self-cleansing, right?
Right.
And that's been my theory because it's a very passive theory, and I find it good for my mental health.
I think and a lot of anti-capitalist investing really is index heavy. Not all indexes are created equal, I would say, as somebody who works pretty extensively with many different kinds of building an index and different kinds of index investing. I think some are much better than others, and some are not very good, and some are good. But generally speaking, especially if you're thoughtful about which index and how is that index constructed and what specific risk does that index expose you to, and are you being thoughtful about uh, how externalities of capitalism, which is an important word in anti-capitalist investing, is externalities, how those may or may not come back to uh, bother you in the very long run of things, because I'm a person who thinks externalities will come back to bother markets expensively and potentially fatally in a good way, where I don't
Right.
necessarily think that markets survive their externalities. And there are some anti-capitalists who don't share that opinion, who think it will take more activity, more agitation to get to that point.
Um, well, and that kind of answers Cyreni's question, which, but it more generally, should we be less weighted towards American stocks because of the inherent capitalist nature? And they said that's something they've personally wrestled with.
Right. I think there's a lot of validity to that argument, and it depends where you redirect. Because if you redirect towards a lot of European equities for socially responsible reasons, it pretty much any objective way that you try to weigh uh, corporate behaviors, Europe is more advanced. And so that would, if you're just weighting things based on that, you're probably a lot more interested in European based corporations. But sometimes international investing is more chaotic and low quality information. And so you may have a country that, even if you're using ESG, but maybe not very advanced in understanding how ESG works, some countries look like they're incredible on an ESG scale, on some ESG scales. I'm thinking of Haiti right now as I'm talking about this, which
Mm,
ostensibly has been more advanced than America. But does that make it a fantastic place to invest as an anti capitalist investor specifically? Not necessarily, because Haiti is phenomenally unequal and very
right.
suffers from a great deal of corruption and exploitation of local populations for certain. And so ESG alone can't always point you uh, towards where you should be investing outside of America. Sometimes it can, but it takes a lot of expertise in ESG uh, implementation to actually make sure you're getting the right information from those data sets.
Yeah, Siren Eye says nobody has a crystal ball that tells you the future, but you do have to deploy your investment dollars somewhere, which
Yeah.
I think is the struggle of a lot of us, right? Like, we want to be anti capitalist, but we also don't want to get a PhD in frigging figuring out how to individually evaluate all of these securities. And opting out isn't an option if you live in a highly financialized society like America, because we don't we don't have the option to not interact with financial institutions. I did know one dude in Eugene who used to be a banker in London and then moved to the middle of the woods and lived without money. But and like just tended a compost pile to recover from being a banker in London. But he's pretty rare.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I need to eat this donut, and I want to make sure that if people have any questions for you that you didn't get a chance to ask, they get to do that before we have to let you go. So I'm gonna I'm gonna play the donut thing, and if people have questions that they want to ask of Chaim, you can type those into the chat while we do the donut thing, because the donut thing is the most important of all the things. All right, here's the donut for today. I will go full screen here. Here is the donut for today. It is a lime coconut twist. Let's see if I can, in any way, like I said, I don't have the person that adjusts my camera for me. So there we go. That's as close as we're going to get. But this is the lime coconut twist. And I was almost going to get you a donut. Heim's not in Portland. Otherwise, I brought you a donut. But I could not. There are no like good donuts in Eugene that aren't companies that are massively violating labor, because Voodoo is really the only one. Their donuts aren't that good. And two, they are currently in a fight with their employees over and had a National Labor Relations Board thing against them. Therefore, I was like, I'm not going to send you a Voodoo donut.
I'm more of a bagel person. Uh, Usually Sunday is bagel day
Yeah.
for me.
Do you find good bagels in Eugene? Because I have really not found good bagels anywhere on the West Coast.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's so relative, because I used to live in New York, which is like, if you've lived in New York and know New York bagels, then nothing ever is quite even a bagel per se. It's a different
Correct.
thing entirely, but relative to that, I guess some of them are okay, but none of them that I can like recommend is like a true actual bagel.
Okay, my review of this, I really don't taste the lime at all, but the coconut is delicious, and it's a very portable shape. It's easier to eat on camera, except for all the stuff that's falling off. I'm gonna take a couple more bites, try to decide. I think it's like a 3 out of 5. I'm I think that's where we're I think that's where we're coming. I think it is gonna be a 3 out of 5. Let's see. I do have it. Use a new software today, so no. 3 out of 5, not 2 out of 5. There we go. That's a 4 out of 5. Oh, I just don't have 3. Well, I can't rate it a 3. It's not a 4. I guess it's a 2 because I don't have a 3 uploaded, so there we go. All right. Let's see. We've got a lot of questions. I'm gonna keep keep eating on this because they're used to me. They see my face all the time eating donuts, but you're new and interesting. What do you think about activist investor funds working on climate like engine number one?
I think activist investing is one of those things that for people, especially people who are people with privilege, very interesting. Activist investing is super important. It depends on what is the purpose of the activist investing, right? Because activist investing to me has an association with value investing, and oftentimes the value investing version of activist investing is you go in, you bully a company to hand over cash to investors as soon as possible, and stop operations entirely. So that's like one version of activist investing is you bully companies to giving you money as an investor in direct payments. And so that flavor is not that exciting because that usually is extremely destructive to labor. The people who actually work at those companies absolutely suffer from the activities of activists. But the people who are trying to get companies to change behaviors or change governance, I think very worthy of our encouragement because a lot of the times, all it really takes is people showing up and saying, look, I'm a shareholder of your company. I want to stay a shareholder. I don't want to take a capital gains hit. I don't want to necessarily disinvest from your company, but I am very interested in your company looking very different. And here's the expectations that I would have of this company if I'm going to continue to be a shareholder. Companies are extremely receptive to that. Some of them have made pretty extensive transformations even as a company just from people showing up and doing that. And so, yeah, I'm
That sounds
in favor.
way too optimistic for this stream.
I know,
The
right?
idea that companies are receptive. Christopher asks a good question, which is like, is there a place where people can exchange information about quote unquote responsible companies? Because, I
Usually
mean, you can
they
obviously look up the annual reports of any publicly traded company in the US, but
right, because most of the people who are collating data on corporate activities are pretty deep nerds. They are pretty much like deep data nerds. They're awesome. I've talked to many of them and do on a regular basis, at MSCI in particular. Very interesting people and interesting lives as data people, but mostly, they're people who are really interested in data sets and very technical people a lot of the time. So they can be easily accessible if you work in finance. It's very easy to like make a time to talk to MSCI or Sustainalytics or Morningstar, any of these uh, data providers, but much more difficult as an individual investor for sure.
well, that follows up with what Bridger asks here. What is a good place to start learning about Azure ES options that are available?
Usually, the third party data providers on markets that professionals use are really good resources. So, Morningstar is probably the most used in professional investing circles because professional investors have to use third party data to um, do reasonable due diligence and prove that you've done that to regulators. You got to prove to regulators that you kind of know what you're talking about and you had to process it.
You can't just be like, oh, I found this stock falling off the back of the truck. and I sold it to my clients.
Right. No, you got to have a process. And so the companies that serve professionals with that due diligence are usually actually some of the best resources because, well, they're also available to the investing public. And etfdb.com, all one word, that's been another really good one, especially if you're interested in getting into some of the subcategories of ESG, like some people are really interested in water strain. I'm definitely a person who's very interested in water policy and water strain, freshwater impact. That's all stuff that you can start learning about from that resource at a top level. And then kind of companies or funds that are doing very well on those metrics, you can go as deep as you want to. You can read annual reports of the companies, and some of those have really awesome insights, and some of them obviously know what they're talking about, and some of them obviously are pretending. And so you can you can
How do you
start.
know, though, as a casual investor? Like, how do you know who's pretending and who isn't, right? If you're not doing this all day like you are.
Right. I think it's very difficult to do casually if you want to be very active, right? Where it's like, if you want
Okay.
to be very active, um, you probably end up doing my job, which there should be more
Yeah.
people doing
Okay.
my
So
job, but
So the conclusion that I think we've reached from this is that one, everything is capitalism; it touches everything. Two, that passive investing is one of the more common anti-capitalist investment strategies, unless you have the resources, time, privilege, ability to spend a lot of time considering becoming a activist investor, considering really doing a lot of deep dive research. If we're gonna like kind of sum up the overall stories from today.
right, passive is generally the best way to go for most people, and even people with very large portfolios. I'm a big believer in passive investing, and end up telling people with $35 million portfolios they should have a bunch of uh, ETFs. And yeah, I think there's
Okay.
no limit on how much money you can have where passive no longer is useful or important.
Okay. All right. Um so I think that answers most of our questions. I know that people are going to be interested in getting even more information from you, and you're teaching a free online class on anti-capitalist investing, right? I think I've linked to it in the
Yes.
description down below. If I haven't already, I will. But promo it here for us.
Right. Yeah. No, I do a series of classes, have for a while now, called the Anti-Capitalist Investor, where I get a lot more in depth in the practical tools and some of the hands-on approaches to do anti-capitalist investing, and also some of the what we might call the epistemology, or how we know what we know of anti-capitalist investing. And I talk a lot in those classes on that, and also give a bunch of resources, and often really interesting discussions happen in those classes. And those are just for fun, they're free. You can show up. I usually do them on like Thursday nights every 2 3 weeks. So the next one is August 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific. And you can find that at the anti-capitalist investor.com, all one word. Um, yeah, you can keep track of
Even
those classes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes,
This
thanks
is,
for
I
having
mean,
me.
I think that we've all, at least I have gone through an up and down of like hopeful and then not hopeful several times over the course of this conversation, because it really does sometimes feel like pushing a boulder uphill, because we're all here. We're all in this post colonialism, fall of capitalism, imminent kind of society, I feel like, while also being completely entangled into all of these systems of capitalism that touch every part of our lives. And I think most of us do not fall over into the I want to live in the woods and tend a compost pile and not touch money for the rest of my life side of anti-capitalist, nor do we live in the I want to invest my money and I don't care if it's killing orphans, and building bombs or something like that. I think most of us kind of exist somewhere in between, but figuring out how to do that, I think, is the constant challenge for a lot of us.
Right.
So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, and hope people enjoy this and come talk more anytime about anti-capitalist investing in those classes, because those are really fun and unique.
Yeah. Thanks you, folks. And I guess the takeaway that we have from this episode from the comments, which also came from the person working at the donut thing. I'm waiting. I'm holding on. I'm trying to put it up here. Right here. Oh, I'm trying to find it, but I've lost it. Which is, well, this vamping is no longer it's taking too long, right? Oh, nope. This is very exciting, isn't it? Nope. Okay. Well, it's gone now. I've lost it. There we go. Oh no, I found it. Sayonai. Have as many donuts as you want. The world is collapsing. That's the theme of 2022.
There we go.
And I think this topic, for regular live stream viewers, just letting you know, we will not be doing. I have a memorial ride for a friend of mine that passed away next week, so I will be doing the live stream at a different time. But I might be doing midweek study with me streams, so keep an eye out for those. If you are on the text crew, then you will get notifications about that. So join textcrew.ohmydollar.com to get text notifications when we go live, just because YouTube isn't always reliable. And thank you, Chaim, very much for being here.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right, cheers. See you all soon. Bye.